Really excited, though, to continue on this topic. The first panel did an amazing job of kind of setting us up, I think, for our discussion here. I'm going to allow each of my panelists to introduce themselves. And again, I'm Mark Tracy, Professor of Sustainable Finance here at IBES, for those of you who might not have seen the earlier panel. So we heard about how business and investors would like to understand and potentially put nature on the balance sheet and start to account for the value of these ecosystem services that we all benefit from. But incumbent upon doing that is the ability to actually measure nature and biodiversity. And I think that's a challenge that our three panelists are all addressing in fantastic ways. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have this panel was to raise the awareness of how far we've come in our ability to measure nature and biodiversity overall. So with that, let's go ahead and start. And Jeannine, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jeannine Cavender-Bares. I'm a professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. I'm the director of the herbaria there. I've only been there more than a year, just over a year and a half. I was at the University of Minnesota for 2 decades. I am also the director of the NSF-funded Biology Integration Institute, ASCEND, which is advancing spectral biology in changing environments to understand biodiversity. And it's a collaborative group of researchers across the country and the world using spectral information, spectroscopic data at all scales, from the level of individual leaves to UAVs to aircraft to satellite, also LIDAR and other remote sensing tools to try to understand biological processes and monitor biodiversity.
Good morning. My name is Jim Kellner. I'm a professor here at Brown in the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. And I'm also a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology. My academic training is in the field of plant biology, and my research program is focused on applications of spaceborne remote sensing, so imaging of the Earth from space, to understanding the surface of our planet, especially things that have to do with biology. I'm an investigator on a NASA mission called the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, which is a type of remote sensing we can talk about later called LIDAR, and it's in orbit on the International Space Station. Outside of Brown, I work with a private company called Perennial. It was founded by 3 former Brown University undergraduates, and it is focused on using remote sensing and machine learning to map carbon content and carbon stocks in the world's agricultural soils in support of a voluntary carbon market.
Good morning. I'm Joe Mascaro. I'm a space ecologist. An old friend asked me, what is a space ecologist? How can you be one if you've never been to space? But I'm a postdoc here at Brown. I work with Jim on the JEDI mission, this laser altimetry mission on the space station. Before that, I was working for 10 years at a public benefit corporation called Planet Labs, which is the largest operator of Earth observation satellites in the commercial markets. And previous to that was my earlier tour in academia. So this is a bit of a return to a research portfolio for me. Very excited to be here and talking with you. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Joe. So I guess, does anyone want to take a crack at a broad definition of what is remote sensing? Just so we make sure the whole audience is with us on this topic.
Happy to do so.
And Jim, you can bring your mic a little closer.
Okay, so remote sensing is simply the measurement of stuff from a remote platform. That's it. Now, we think of it as images. You can think of it as a picture. It often is a picture, and it often is an image, but it doesn't have to be. It can be points. For example, LIDAR, stands for light detection and ranging, is a laser beam that is emitted, and it's returned to the sensor as a point, and that point is a location in 3 dimensions. Produces a cloud of data. If you've ever seen a point cloud online, modern vehicles use LIDAR to know how close they are to other vehicles, to help out with lane change assist and things like that. A great analogy to understand remote sensing is to recognize that, yes, it's a picture, but there's data in that picture. And that's what's really important about it. And the kind of data that's in there depends on the wavelength and other characteristics of the type of remote sensing device that it is. So your camera on your smartphone, it sees in the visible wavelengths of light. Those are the ones that we see with our eyes, red, green, blue. But you can design a sensor that can see in the ultraviolet, where you can't see but a bird can. You can design a sensor that can see in the infrared and all kinds of other places in the spectrum. And a good way to think about that is to use medical imaging as our analogy. A CT scan, an X-ray, an MRI, nuclear imaging, all of these are really kind of like remote sensing. What those do is allow you to learn things about the human body. Some see soft tissue, some see vessels, some see nerves, some see bones. And that works even though you can't see inside a body. What you can do is use that device to produce an image and then display that image in a way that you can see. So when you look at an X-ray image, that is a visual light representation of X-ray radiation that you cannot see. Imagine you do that from space or from an aircraft looking at the surface of the Earth. That's what we're talking about here. And the kinds of things that it allows you to learn about is structure. So how tall is something? Has it changed over time? You can learn about physiological condition, how much water is in a plant, how much nitrogen is in a plant, how much phosphorus is in a plant. You can learn about the real-time operation of the plant. There's a new measurement called solar-induced fluorescence that tells us about agricultural crop yields. We're looking at light being emitted from the plant itself. You can't see it with your eyes, but we can measure it. So we can learn things about the underlying physiological condition of that organism. So the simple takeaway is remote sensing is a way of looking at the spatial distribution of different kinds of material and condition, and the ability to do that over time from the air and space.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. And why is this necessary? Well, of course, the planet is enormous. We just give you one example from farming, which is something I spent a lot of my career working with. You know, a typical row crop farm in the United States is 3,000 to 5,000 acres. But soil varies by square meter in terms of its content. So if you're going to start sampling soil samples to really understand what you have in the soil, what nutrients are there, you have to send an individual out today and scoop dirt into a test tube and bring it back to the lab, and it costs $100. And now you know something about 1 point in a 4,000 acre field. So even if you were to sample every 100 acres, that's 40 samples. You know, you see the math there. It's a huge barrier to understanding some of these things in a granular detail. So in the last, I don't know, you guys can tell me better, but we've had tremendous breakthroughs in our ability to remote sense information about the planet in the last 20 or 30 years. Much of this through publicly available satellite information. And this has really allowed us to have new insights. And that's why we wanted to have this panel and talk about how these insights can be applied back to nature. So Jeannine, in your lab, what remote sensing do you use and what do you look at specifically?
Okay, well, we do a range of things, but I'm going to speak to your soil example
Please.
first. So soil is tricky. Understanding soil processes that can't even be seen from above, making inferences about that is tricky. But we've actually had good success doing it. And I will say the caveat is you have to do it ecosystem by ecosystem. And so we have done careful soil work looking at enzyme activities and nutrient concentrations and respiration rates, soil process rates, measured those carefully across large-scale experiments in the Midwest, like at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve and in Nebraska. And we have been able to model those processes such that from the variation in the vegetation, the chemical composition of the vegetation, and the cover and biomass of the vegetation, we can make predictions about how we think inputs from above will influence soil processes. And then we can use those predictions and use machine learning models to capture the variation that we've measured in the soil and using spectroscopic data from airborne platforms. So this is full range spectroscopic imagery. We're able to predict below ground processes and process rates in different systems, but that we cannot use a model from one ecosystem and apply it to another. We can extend out the inferences across the whole ecosystem and the variation within the ecosystem, but we can't apply models from, say, Minnesota to Nebraska. So I think what my theme might be here, since I'm with two incredible remote sensing scholars, I'm trained in biology first. My pitch is going to be that we really need to understand the biology. We need to understand how ecosystems vary. We need to understand the biological processes. And if we can do that, then we can use remote sensing to extend that knowledge across spatial extents.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. And it's something that industry kind of lumps into, ground truth, right? But that's a dramatic oversimplification of the understanding that's needed and required to be able to make these insights at scale. Joe, at Planet, in your previous life, you saw and interacted with a number of institutions who were very interested in extracting insights from spatial data, geospatial data. You want to talk a little bit about what those customers and clients were like and the types of things that they were looking at?
Yeah, let me back up from that to just historically. So we've been doing remote sensing from space since the days where we first began to take analog photographs. There's an Air Force museum in Ohio. You should all go there. It's amazing. They have a sort of leftover Keyhole 8 spy satellite. And it had an analog film canister, like an old camera, and literally just ran through this film canister until it was full, and then shot out the film canister, which re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, and a parachute deployed, and then it was tow-hooked out of the sky by an aircraft piloted by US military officers. They have the plane, they have the little retro rocket with the canister, and they have the satellite. We didn't have public Earth observation satellite imagery really until 1972. That's when the first Landsat satellite was deployed, which was very experimental at the time. Nowadays, we have economies of scale taking hold in low Earth orbit. And this has completely transformed and created the kinds of industries that Mark is asking about. Agriculture companies that acquire satellite imagery to improve their crop yields or improve fertilizer management. We have a huge NASA European Space Agency infrastructure of hundreds of satellites. And on the point of the economies of scale, I want to mention Starlink, which is not an Earth observation platform. However, it is a economies of scale platform in space. There are 10,000 SpaceX communication satellites in space. I want to encourage everyone to hold on to some cognitive dissonance here, because this is the part where we would talk about the environmental damage for astronomy, for example, or the potential pollutants entering the atmosphere, and those things are very important. But I think what's important for this panel, and with respect to the financial markets that we talked about this morning, is that there are 10,000 communication satellites orbiting the Earth right now, and 10 years ago there were dozens, hundreds at the most, in low Earth orbit. Imagine all of those satellites with cameras. Imagine all of those satellites with the kinds of cameras that Jim and Jeannine have been talking about. We absolutely have the technology to do that right now, and that means we're going to enter a world where we are living in an ocean of measurement data, of remote sensing data about the Earth. And this is literally creating billion-dollar, trillion-dollar economies of the absorption of all this sensor data, the processing of it with AI, and the improvements of revenue-generating products and solutions for these kinds of spaces that we talked about this morning.
Thank you. That was great context. Where in Ohio is this museum? Because I want to make plans.
It's in Dayton.
Of course. Okay,
If anyone's been to the Dulles Museum in DC, the Smithsonian wing, where they have a space shuttle and they have an SR-71, this Air Force Museum in Ohio is 5 times the size of the Dulles Museum.
Wow. All right. We got to talk about that at break. So I don't want to just go from ground level, where I was talking about scooping up soil, straight to space, we've got other layers, right? So, Jim, you have a drone that has what LiDAR instrumentation mounted on that drone. You give people a feel for how many acres those kind of instruments can cover now, especially as maybe even a fancier drone than you have now in the lab.
Yeah, so there is a hierarchy of, we could call it observational capability, and there are some trade-offs involved. The spaceborne observation is great because it's orbiting the Earth and essentially sees everything. And with the constellation of sensors that are in orbit now, we get essentially one complete image of the Earth. I mean, Joe probably knows better than me, but I usually say every few days. If you're talking about high-quality, cloud-free observation, every few days there's a complete image of the Earth, but at a spatial resolution that might not be as good as you would like. Maybe every pixel represents a 10 by 10 or 30 by 30 or even less than that meter square. It's going to depend on what kind of sensor we're talking about. You go down a level, you get to airborne remote sensing. Same kinds of sensors, but now they're flown on an aircraft. And those can produce sensors, or excuse me, images that are in the spatial resolution of centimeters. There are also some that are getting centimeter data from space, but not everywhere. Aircraft, you can map tens of square kilometers to hundreds of square kilometers at a time. It's not that it's impossible to do more than that, but you start to run into an economy of scale problem where people just aren't going to do that because flight hours are expensive. You go one level down from there and you're into drones. Now, I'm talking about small commercial drones of the kind that you've probably seen flying around, little quadcopters and things. But there are also some that are slightly larger than that, traditional gasoline-powered helicopters, wings. So these are more traditional, look like an aircraft, but they're what would be owned by a person. You could have one as a hobbyist or as a researcher. And what those give you the ability to do is get really, really high spatial resolution information. Think of it where every individual pixel in the image might be just a few millimeters of space on the ground. So you can have many individual pixels on a single leaf of a plant.
And let me jump in. A pixel is just one part of an image that is visible.
Right. So pull out your phone, take a picture, zoom way in, do the pinch zoom, go way in, and eventually you'll see blocks. Those blocks are individual pixels. Stands for picture element. And that's because that thing is acquired by a square in your phone called a focal plane. Doesn't really matter, but that's where pixels come from. So when those pixels are small, it changes a bunch of things. It means that we're now able to understand the world at a different scale of observation. Your comment about biology. Well, how do you think about biology at a 30-meter pixel? I know I have felt in the past like I sometimes had to stop being a biologist when I started doing that. And I was attracted to drone-based remote sensing because I felt that the scale of the observation was aligned with the way that I understood the world intuitively. I know what a tree is, and maybe it's even at a level beneath what I need. I don't really think about individual leaves that much, but a plant physiologist would, right? And so now you can link between the intuitive and laboratory-based understanding that we have of plants that is mechanistic. You can link that to observations from drones, from the air, and from space.
And Jeannine, for you and the kind of mapping that you do of forest composition, what type of instrumentation do you use?
Well, we have worked at all of those scales, from drones to aircraft to different satellites with different pixel resolution. And we have a project right now that's really exciting because it uses publicly available hyperspectral data from EMIT, which is a 60-meter pixel, and DCIS, its German satellite, has a 30-meter pixel size. So you can't see individual trees, but you can see forest communities. And we use an ordination approach. We use a statistical approach where we take advantage of all the data that the U.S. Forest Service has collected across the entire United States. And every tree is monitored. We have functional trait information for all of those trees. We have their phylogenetic relatedness, meaning we know how their evolutionary relationships are using molecular data. And we also know the community compositions of all of those forest plots. And so we use that to build models that we then connect with the emit data or the DESIS data, and we can build models that map out community composition based on forest community type, or functional composition with actual functional traits. Or we can map where are all the oaks, where are all the pines, where are the willows. And we can do that at a pretty decent resolution over vast areas, over entire states. So that gives us a way to actually understand the composition of the forest at a scale that makes sense from an ecological perspective. You could use that to verify that your conservation easement is, that you are making good on that. If there were biodiversity credits, you could show these maps that you are maintaining that land. The composition and the function is being maintained. These kinds of maps would be very good for verification of stewardship of land. We also have used higher resolution information, Sentinel-2 data, maybe at 10 meter pixels, and we've been using that. We actually build the models using NAPE data, that's sub-meter data, and we can detect sick trees. And for many years, we've been working on the oak wilt. It's a fungal pathogen in the Midwest that affects many oak trees, and it's very worrisome, but it can actually be treated, and the Forest Service is working very hard to abate it. Here in the East, we have emerging diseases like the beech leaf disease that's killing the beeches, and the hemlock decline from the woolly adelgid. And we can build models that sees a whole tree canopy. And find where the sick trees are, and we're working to differentiate, well, what is the cause of the disease? Is it this disease or that one, or is it drought or some other stressor? And then we've also worked at the airborne level with like sub-meter pixels, where we can really differentiate every tree species, and we can also figure out whether the tree is healthy or sick and figure out why. So those are the kinds of things we've done. Those could all be scaled up.
So you also mentioned biodiversity credits, or often referred to sometimes as nature assets as well. And I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I think that is some important connective tissue here that, one of the challenges that we've seen with the voluntary carbon market, which we had a great event here 2 years ago talking about that for a day long, thanks to Steven and Jim, was, one of the challenges there has been verification, particularly with nature-based sequestration of carbon. And so I think this issue is very important as we start to learn from some of the shortcomings of the carbon market, and we move into this potential of having nature assets. That, one, we make sure that the benefits of these assets go to the communities who are stewards of nature, and that's transparent and clear. And we'll talk a little bit about that at our next panel, actually. Two, that there's scientific rigor in terms of understanding what is actually being preserved. And three is really the measurement and transparency around that measurement. So we've talked about basically everything from space on down, but I also want to add there's other types of measurement as well on the ground that is scalable, that's still remote sensing, like acoustic monitoring, for example, where we have microphones that are listening and collecting sounds, and we can use machine learning to process what animals, what birds, what insects have we heard in that. Relatively low cost, relevant to some of these other remote sensing mechanisms. We also have camera traps that have been used with some effectiveness, and specifically, there's some nature assets programs around charismatic species and capturing them on these camera traps. So I didn't want to lose that element as well, that we can get even more granular, and of course, topics like eDNA as well. So I don't know, any of you could jump in on this. And of course, Jim, as you point out, we can get down to centimeters of resolution. So if you haven't seen any of these LiDAR point clouds that Jim's talking about, you literally can see leaves on trees and bushes and leaves of grass in some cases if it's tall enough and big enough. So the capacity now to paint a rich 3D picture of what is in the ecosystem is well beyond anything that was possible before. So that's my excitement of having this kind of panel to raise awareness of what is possible. What are the limitations? I mean, Jeannine, you talked about the need to really think about the biology, and that's very complex and doesn't transfer necessarily across broad regions. So is that one specific limitation? Are there others?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that you have to do the work on the ground to build the models and verify the models. What you pick up from above is only as good as the work you've done on the ground. It allows you to extend what you've measured on the ground. And I think it can be easy to get enamored with the technology and forget that you still have to do the biology. So I think I'll just keep saying that over and over again because you know, you can't interpret the signals without having measured things on the ground and knowing what you're looking at. And that goes for camera traps too. I mean, you can automate these processes, you can involve citizen scientists, you still have to do the real work to make sure you understand these organisms and how they live, their natural history. What do they need in terms of habitat? What does it take to actually keep a whole population of organisms alive? So this kind of information, we don't want to lose our knowledge of biological systems, even as we're able to see it from above at larger extents, larger and larger scales.
Yeah, and I think the tension that will always exist is that we need solutions that are scalable at lower cost, right? Because if we have an amazing biodiversity preservation project that's looking at biodiversity in an intense granular manner on a square meter basis, there's going to be tremendous cost in that. And so there's probably this uncomfortable middle ground. I was going to say comfortable, but it's an uncomfortable middle ground where we can still have a very positive impact on the preservation of nature, but have it be at a lower cost, scalable, remote sensing type of solution. Joe, as your experience there, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, already on this panel, we've heard 10 meter, sub-meter, 30 meter. We've heard about drones, other types of ground-based sensors, including our phones, our own eyeballs, space-based sensors. It seems to me that a perennial challenge with respect to banking on nature and how the finance mechanisms and machinery of the global economy can relate to these concepts of pixels, of trying to quantify biodiversity or carbon with these sensors, is definitions and standards. This is a very tricky area. I spoke to a very close colleague that I worked together with her for 10 years at Planet, Tara O'Shea. She's now the managing director of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford at the Wood Center. And this is still a hard problem. What is a forest? What is a tree? What is willow? Is it salix? Are we only talking about the trees? There are some salix that are shrubs. With carbon, things are a little bit easier because carbon is an element on the periodic table and we can all sort of agree on the objective reality of carbon. And even if we can't measure it perfectly, it can be in principle fungible with the global economy. But just this week, Stephen Porter's on the faculty here shared a paper around the department by Sarah Castle and colleagues that said that I think 8 or 9 different satellite data sets trying to quantify forest cover on the planet agree by only 26%. So that is tragically bad in terms of our ability to have definitions and standards that would allow forest cover or say forest conservation programs to translate in and out with a fungible liquid global economy where we're placing value on nature. I think a really hard problem for the biology side of this, to Jeannine's points, is that this gets, in my view, harder and harder as you get into biodiversity, where the concepts become a little bit intrinsically less fungible or more difficult to define as they relate to economic principles. that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an area where the science has benefited from very significant public support in forms of government putting up satellites. Both the EU and the US have publicly available satellite data. We know that the military was very interested in this, particularly in the Cold War, and did things like even tried to analyze from U-2 planes what the condition of the wheat crop looked like in the Soviet Union, for example. And Jim, you're working with NASA on the JEDI instrument. How do you feel about the support going forward for remote sensing from a geospatial point of view? It seems to wax and wane in the popular imagination of Americans of their interest in space, and we're kind of at an interesting time.
That's a very complicated question. I mean, what I would say is that we see that the level of congressional support for NASA seems strong, right? And we have to distinguish here between the level of support within the federal government for the kind of research that we're talking about up here that Jeannine or I might do, or that Joe might do in a biologically based research program at a university. That's different from the support for the actual hardware, the actual instrumentation. I'm talking about funding missions. It seems to me that the level of support for funding missions remains pretty solid. And I think part of that is because it's clear that there are enormous benefits to society across many different kinds of applications, including ones that were just impossible to anticipate. Joe has a long list of examples of amazing applications of planet data, just as one example. Ask him about it afterward. It's amazing stuff you can't even imagine people would think about trying to measure from space. People are measuring from space. So from that perspective, I would say things look pretty good. And when I look at even trends, the number of satellites in low Earth orbit is rising. We are living through an era where the world as we know it is becoming fundamentally not just observable, but observed by multiple sensors operating in multiple parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, day and night, almost all the time. And that's a kind of profound change in our ability to interrogate, understand, analyze, and think about the surface of our own planet.
Yeah, as Joe nicely queued up, the economics have changed in terms of getting these instruments into space. So I know I personally have talked to private companies talking about putting hyperspectral implementation or hyperspectral instrumentation into geospatial orbit. So I'm sure in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see all kinds of new instruments up there beyond just the Starlink kind of example.
Well, the surface biology geology mission is officially on pause right now, but that's the NASA hyperspectral mission that was planned to go into orbit this year, but is not. The Europeans have chime. They were meant to go in tandem, but both are 30-meter pixels. Planet is, you can explain about that, but it's much higher resolution, but a whole bunch of different instruments measuring in slightly, well, I'll let you explain.
There's a couple of, on hyperspectral, it's interesting. So we're talking about the evolution of sensor technology. I mean, when did we get the iPhone? 2008, 2007, something like that. This huge geometric increase in the number of satellite platforms. Several NASA missions have been mentioned. JEDI is a full up and down NASA mission. It's built at Goddard Space Flight Center. It's R&D. There's one instrument. It's government funded. It's procured by the government, and it's public data. But the marketplace of the hardware has changed. There are a huge number of public-private sector partnerships. I'll mention one that is much closer to JEDI, which is called EDGE. This is a mission that's not yet flown, but it was recently promoted into NASA Phase B, which means it will fly if budget realities stay consistent, somewhat consistent. This has a private sector element of it. The bus, which is the piece of the satellite that is literally like a school bus. It carries all the stuff, the payload and everything, is a digital globe. It's now called Lanteris or Vantor, but it's a private company bus. Planet operates a mission called Tanager, which has a partnership between Planet, JPL, the state of California, I believe. You'll have to look this up. I no longer speak for Planet. There's another hyperspectral mission which has already, I think, ended its life, but was very impactful, called MethaneSat, that had some public-private sector elements of it, including nonprofit funding from, I'm going to blank on it, EDF, thank you to the audience. So this is about the organizational engineering of how the sensors are built, how they're deployed to space, who is operating them, what are the procurement models. We often talk about public data. When we say Landsat, like JEDI, is a public mission sort of top to bottom. It's a NASA procured, USGS and NASA operated mission. But it is not even Landsat without its private sector commercial revenue making dimensions. The bus of Landsat is a Northrop Grumman piece of hardware. The payload, the imaging payload, the camera on Landsat is a Ball Aerospace payload. That's another private aerospace company. So I think we're seeing a lot of organizational engineering. There are other places in the world you will see this. If anyone's been to the Bay Area or Austin or DC recently, I think DC, New York maybe, they've seen Waymo vehicles without human beings on board, and they've seen these little spinning widgets all around them, right? Those are LiDAR instruments on those Waymo cars. They're different than the LiDAR that Jim is operating on the drone that he talked about earlier, but they're not that different. And so what's happening is economies of scale are driving these sensors that we use in our day-to-day lives. They're driving sensors that we use to operate vehicles autonomously, et cetera. And all of this stuff is now being proliferated into orbit. And the major thing that has been unblocked is the literal cost per pound to get stuff from the ground on Earth into space. This number has fallen and fallen precipitously in recent years. And NASA is a beneficiary of it. JEDI flew on a SpaceX Falcon 9 vehicle, which was a cheaper vehicle than NASA had paid previously to different kind of rocket opportunities. So I would just say this is really optimistic. It has a lot of externalities that impact other parts of the economy. Maybe later today we'll talk about prior informed consent, which is that taking pictures from space is not necessarily intrinsically a good thing, depending on who's taking the pictures, of whom, what they're being used for. But I would say, to emphasize, we're just living in this new reality where there's this proliferation of sensor technology and an ocean of data, and now these new AI models and all kinds of other approaches to break down those enormous data sets and build these types of carbon monitoring, biodiversity monitoring, and other types of products and solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And we will talk about free prior informed consent on our 1 p.m. panel. Maybe not in the full depth of all the issues that are there. I mean, I think about having worked with farmers. Farmers are very sensitive about who's taking pictures of their land, right? And so much so that geospatial orbit has been more desirable for people who want to commercialize that, because if you fly a drone over a farm, it's not unheard of for a farmer to take a shot at that drone, try to knock it out of the air. So there is real sensitivity to this issue. And Jeannine, you want to add?
Well, I wanted to come back to something that you said, Joe, a while ago about the difficulty of even monitoring forest extent. And I actually think we will get those models right. We have good methods, and there are ways to do that well. I think one of the issues that we haven't really talked about is, what are we measuring when we measure biodiversity? What do we even mean by that? And there's a lot of confusion, like, are we counting spiders, or are we measuring forest extent? And the Europeans have come up with the essential biodiversity variables. They have relatively low diversity in Europe, and they can probably measure every species and population sizes and all of those things. In North America, we have much higher diversity. It's hard to measure every single species from remote sensing, but we can measure things like functional diversity, how much chemical variation that we see, and how is that correlated with a really healthy forest. We can actually map the major groups of species, like where all the willows are, even if we don't know which willow, species exactly, where all the oaks are. We can see that there's more diversity in the southern states, and we can get pretty granular about metrics that are associated with healthy forests, intact forests, and those that are associated with degraded forests, or we can certainly see the difference between prairie, grassland, agricultural systems. We can see all of that. And then, we do have ways of linking that to agreed upon standards for what we actually mean in terms of what we're trying to do. 30 by 30 is trying to keep 30% of our land an intact area for biodiversity, restoration, 30% of our degraded land being restored. When we get into the tropics, it gets much more complicated because there's no way you're going to measure individual species or even genera, which the genus is the next level up where we group species into a genus, then to a family and this kind of thing. But you both are friends with Andrew Davies. He's working on the African continent, and they're using LIDAR to measure structural complexity, which they then correlate with bird diversity or different animal diversity, and it correlates really well, and it's really the potential for habitat, having the kind of habitat that enables different species to live. And so it's a ecosystem kind of measurement, a structural complexity measurement that correlates with biodiversity and is pretty scalable. So every system may have to work out their own measures and their own ways of doing this, but I'm very confident that we can do it well, and that the international science policy, the IBES process, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is just releasing their monitoring report for good ways to do this. And there's the next global assessment that will be using this. I'm part of that. And I think we will come to ways of using information to monitor biodiversity effectively. So it's hard, but I think we can do it. It's just, we're not going to do it the same way we do it for carbon. It's not you just measure how much carbon's in the system or even methane. It's every region is going to have to be measured with slightly different metrics to really accommodate the changing biodiversity across the globe.
It's a sign of great panelists when they read your mind and start going in the direction you want to go. And I put in a plug for our 2:30 panel, which is going to feature some early stage businesses that are putting this exact information to work. So working with Andrew Davies on biodiversity capacity to try and enable nature assets in Africa, and then similar work in remote sensing with forest conservation. So I encourage you to consume that as well. And just quickly, and I welcome people to come up if they have questions, because we're getting kind of into our last 15 minutes. But Jeannine, you mentioned the EU's approach to managing or measuring biodiversity. I'd love if you could expand on that a little bit more. I mean, that is one of my concerns, is that they're going to promulgate a standard that the rest of the world thinks is a reasonable standard, but given their ecosystem and you lightly touched on the limitations of that for other geographies. Can you talk a little bit about what the Europeans are looking at, and if you agree, how expensive that may be to implement?
Yeah, the Europeans have a roadmap now. It's billions and billions of dollars. I don't know how many billions. I think $33 billion per year or something, but I could be way off on that. But they are putting the sensor technology all across the European landscape, all countries, and they have essential biodiversity variables. They want to know species, population sizes, genetic diversity within some of the species. They have ecosystem habitat variables, and within there's have 84 different types of metrics, and they can probably do it because they have the technology, they have people on the ground in every country, and they've agreed to do this. Is it a blueprint for the rest of the world? I think in temperate systems where there aren't that many species, it could be a blueprint if other places had the resources, but other places may not have the resources, and when the diversity gets really high, it isn't going to apply. So we have to come up with other ways that are not so expensive and that could actually accommodate higher diversity. And I think those methods exist. They're just going to look different than what the Europeans are doing. And kudos to them for being so organized and getting this together and agreeing to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's an important distinction to understand that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, nor should it be, and that there's other scientific measurements that will be beneficial, that will get us farther in the direction we want to go, but maybe not nearly as expensive or comprehensive initially. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to come up forward. And Seb, you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, I have a question for Professor Jean. And so my question is
Seb, if you can get a little closer to the microphone, it'd be
yeah,
great.
and so my question would be like, in looking at all the biology of these ecosystems, I wonder like what are some of the most interesting patterns that you have seen that replicate across different biological ecosystems that are non-obvious?
The most interesting patterns that I've seen across ecosystems. Well, I could talk about our own work, but I mean, it's some of the work that Greg Asner's group has done in Peru, really mapping biodiversity and then connecting that to action on the ground is pretty inspiring. We have been able to, at large spatial extents, see diseased trees, and we've been working with the National Park Service to verify that a pixel on the ground with that says it's a diseased tree actually is. And if we can refine these well enough so that they're useful for people managing land, it saves a lot of time and resources to then be able to go focus on those that new outbreak that they didn't know was sick. They can address it right away and prevent the spread of these diseases.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for coming out here. I had a question that was kind of touched upon, which is about like data sovereignty, and like I know like the fact of like all of this, like these different methods are really good and help to understand the ecosystem, but how do you balance like the need for transparency for science and also like the data sovereignty of these communities that are around these ecosystems?
Jim or Joe, you want to take that?
Well, Jim can say more about I'm about to mention the JEDI calibration plots. So this JEDI mission is not just a space mission. It has a series of thousands of field plots where trees have been measured and carbon has been estimated on the ground. Some of those are completely open, like you can just download the data right now. Others are partly anonymized. The plot locations may not be available, but the list of species are, or the sizes of the trees are. And some of them are sort of totally anonymized. Why is this the case? Because exactly of this very important question that you raise. In order for a country or a jurisdiction to, say, sell carbon credits on an open market, they need to control some sovereignty of how those carbon credits are measured on the ground, how accurate they are. They may want the economic participation or the scientific participation of their local community. They may want to lead the effort. So there is an increasingly, I think, important distinction between the virtues of open data and some of the risks of open data. Because in this type of marketplace that we've been talking about today, there are serious risks. And one of these risks is just that if you make all the plot data available, all the satellite imagery available and so forth, then a different jurisdiction can quantify your ecosystem services from across the pond and start trading or making economic transactions based on it. So I think it's an important question. I don't have an answer, but maybe Jim or Jeannine want to say more about the openness of some of the ingredients of plot data and remote sensing data that are in these projects.
I'll answer it from a slightly different perspective and talk about what I've seen in the private sector. So the company that I work for outside of Brown, Perennial, it measures soil organic carbon in the world's agricultural land, and to do that, we need ground data. And so we often will end up in a situation where we have a contract with a private company. It could be a very large agricultural company that has many thousands of individual measurements of soil organic carbon that we use to calibrate the model. And those relationships are all different. Sometimes they will permit us to use those data to develop a model that can only be used for their location. Sometimes it can be used anywhere we want, and there's everything in between. And part of that's about the protection of their own IP. It's also about risk, though, as Joe points out. Imagine a claim is made, this much carbon is there, this is how it changed over time, and somebody wishes to challenge that claim. They might wish to say, we believe you made a claim that was false for some reason. I'm not implying bad intent. I'm just saying the claim can be challenged. It's a claim that generates a financial transaction. That could end up getting all the way back down to what was the data you used to generate the claim. So if company A provides data that you use to generate the claim, company A could in a sense be held responsible or be part of an investigation, end up getting subpoenaed, be exposed to discovery by allowing their data to be open. All of which is to say it's extremely complicated and not as simple as just do the right thing and make your data open. I think what we would need to fix this would be changes in law that provide some degree of protection such that to make one's data open does not automatically expose one to potential limitless future risk.
Thanks, Jim. Stephen?
Yeah, thanks. This is an awesome panel to ask an unanswerable question to. So as someone who has played also in the sort of remote sensing and of ecosystems space and then watched what happens with the joy of scientific discovery then spinning out into the marketplace, the question I have is really about protecting against fads. So we all have experienced over our scientific careers this new instrument comes on board, there's a new measurement. You mentioned solar induced fluorescence, which I've noticed you don't mention as much as you did 10 years ago. LIDAR comes out, we think we can measure soil carbon from space, but can we really? But then the market takes those ideas and runs with them way faster than the science often can keep up with. And it happens in both directions. You see a science paper that says forest carbon markets are all garbage, and the number of transactions on the forest carbon side of things drops by almost an order of magnitude. You see someone saying enhanced rock weathering works, and they win the X Prize, and all of a sudden it's all over the news and there are companies doing it, and the science is nowhere near there. So I guess my question for you is, in your experience as bridging between science and private, how worried are you versus optimistic are you that banking on nature, which is is gonna work when the private sector moves so much faster than we can move as scientists? And I think all of you have something to say about that.
I want to jump in right away because my career has taken let's say a very unpredictable turn. I worked in the private sector in a very senior role, most recently before coming to Brown to do a postdoc, and it's my second postdoc in 20 years. I wanted to rediscover my scientific curiosity. I don't think that scientists can help being curious. I feel like it just comes with the job. And curiosity, some neuroscientists think that curiosity is a drive, like hunger. And that when you're in a state of curiosity, your problem solving improves, your creativity improves. My personal view is that it disappoints me when the scientific community tries to shutter a line of research or an approach to mitigate climate change, whatever it is, whether it's carbon removal, which is a great example of one that is highly controversial, carbon capture and sequestration involving things like direct air capture. You can search for direct air capture and find 1,000 articles that say, what a waste of time, talent being wasted, this is such a bad idea, it's a slippery slope. All it does is allow companies to, figure out new ways to burn carbon. Well, there were, I think, 99% of all the space companies said that a reusable rocket could not be created. Impossible. Physics prevent it. You will never be able. They came on panels like this and said, absolutely not. And I went to Florida and saw with my own eyes a thing the size of a 737 flying back from space and firing its engines and landing on this platform. And whatever you want to say about the space industry, Reusable rockets are a sustainability technology. They're a renewable energy technology. I mean, they are a carbon mitigation technology. They reduce our impact when we operate and move things into space. That's incredible. So I would encourage the scientists in the room and scientists in general to not lose sight of their curiosity, the part of their problem-solving skills that is driven by pure passion. It's really what I'm here to rediscover, and it's been a thrill. And yeah, I mean, don't lose sight of that, because that's an optimistic mindset that is exactly the kind of problem-solving mindset we need to solve some of these big challenges.
Go ahead, Jeannine.
Okay, I think I will answer your question by emphasizing the importance of the role of government. So the U.S. Forest Service has hundreds of thousands of plots all over the country that it measures every year. That's really good data. That parts of it are open access, but not the georeference part of it. But that is really critical data for all of these models. It's undisputed. There's a nationwide data system that works really well. Then you have the National Ecological Observatory Network. The National Science Foundation has invested over $700 million just getting it off the ground. These are observatories in every biome ecoregion across the nation that use airborne spectroscopic imagery. They can fly LiDAR too. They've got plots on the ground measuring different aspects of biodiversity. They have eddy flux towers measuring fluxes of carbon dioxide, water, other greenhouse gases. These are huge investments that we've made to understand our ecosystems and our biodiversity, and we don't have to dispute the data. They're doing soil measurements, water measurements. There are all kinds of other things I'm not mentioning that the government has invested in for us to have good data. So let's keep that going, and let's keep the science going so that we can use and understand that information, and that could alleviate some of these issues that we're talking about.
Thank you. We've got another question. I think just perfect timing for one last one.
Hi, okay, so my name is Jules and I work in ecology and science communication. And so, first of all, I just wanted to say that I really resonated with the idea of just like awe-inspiring our work, but also this need to protect the things that we're in awe of. And so I guess my question is, a lot of biodiversity science starts with this intrinsic organismal level research, aka we just love organisms, we just love biodiversity. But that can sometimes appear as sort of like a scientist ivory tower curiosity to policy or finance audiences. But it is exactly that knowledge that allows us to build the instruments and models that measure biodiversity across scales, which is really important given when climate change is making risk localized and differential across various scales. So I'm just curious, like, how do you guys communicate the practical value of that deep ecological understanding to decision makers who rely on standardized metrics?
You want to take a crack at that, Jim?
I'll be happy to. So I completely agree with your framing about the intrinsic value. I think you sort of have to believe in the intrinsic value of nature to become a biologist. You're excited, you wondered about it, you enjoyed it when you were a child, you looked at birds, you listened to them in the mornings. For me, that's a Hawaiian rainforest. I love it and I don't need any more justification than that. That's enough right there, just knowing that it's there. And I'm happy when I'm in it. And I have learned that when I talk to other people about the value of nature, I need to learn what they value. I need to not assume that they're going to agree with me about the uniqueness based on geographic isolation and an evolutionary history that makes Hawaii's biota unique. That may not be enough for them, but maybe they value nature for some other reason. And maybe I can find out what that reason is, and that can become a point of common understanding between us, even if those two things are not the same. There's an example I would offer to you. There's this very depressing paper published a few years ago that describes that the population of birds across many species in North America has declined by something like 30% since the 1970s. And this just ruined my day the day that I read this paper, because I like birds and I want to live in a world where they are there. If you dig into the details of the paper, there are some examples in there where there are some birds that have actually increased. And a majority of the cases where the bird populations are increasing have things in common. They're birds that we manage. Raptors, because of the banning of DDT, their populations have gone up. Wetland birds, their populations are also stable or increasing. The wetland birds were especially interesting to me. There were also managed populations in there that are in there because they are hunted. Ducks Unlimited is a conservation organization for ducks today, and people think of it as duck preservation. It was founded by hunters who realized that if they didn't preserve wetlands, they would have no place to go and shoot ducks. And I found that to be both ironic and optimistic all at the same time. Here's these people who wanted to be able to shoot ducks, and because they wanted to be able to shoot ducks, that led to wetland preservation, and it led to managed populations of ducks that are in fact not declining today to the same degree as other bird species. So the takeaway for me was, we can do this. If we care enough to manage something, we can do something about it. But I have to be willing to listen to what other people's values about nature are. Maybe it's rock climbing. Maybe it's bicycle riding. Maybe it's a reserve that nobody goes into, and that could lead to some irreconcilable challenges. But maybe we can agree on the value of nature from our own point of view.
Thanks, Jim. Just a note of housekeeping. We are going to break here. For those of you who are online or in person, we'll continue with virtual panels. We have 2 more. The next one starts at 1 p.m. And if you have any questions about those, please let us know. But before I end, I just want to thank our panelists today, and please join me in a round of applause.